First of all, I'd like to welcome everyone to this morning's information session titled Children of the Sky, Connecting Cultures Across the Pacific with Migratory Birds. And we'd like to welcome our presenters, Angutekaraq Estelle Thomson, who is the president of the Native Village of Paimiut Traditional Council, and Daniel Ruthrauff, wildlife biologist from the U.S. Geological Survey. For everyone's information, this webinar is being hosted by the Alaska Tribal Resilience Learning Network under the Alaska Climate Adaptation Science Center in partnership with the Native American Fish and Wildlife Society. Pakajangatsti, aguarokatka, ilamam spatsanam pilaratna, Queen Harmiunga, Angayokaka, Atchurunak, Uyuratjak, Maurloka, Chigumyuk, Aparloka, Tutmalga, Atamaso, Angayokak, Angivran, and Atmahalak. Queen Harmiunga. Good morning, how are you? My name is Geraldine Hill Kelly. I am from Quinnahock. My parents are Mary and John. My maternal grandparents are Martha Pleasant and Peter Oldfriend. And my paternal grandparents are Elena Jones and Willie Hill, all from my home village where I work and live of Quinnahock, Alaska. As with all of our sessions, this session is being recorded to post on our website. And some of the quick Zoom reminders we have, like if you are calling in, please mute your phone. If you don't have a dedicated mute button, pressing *6 should mute your phone. If you're using your computer audio, all participants have been muted. During the question and answer session, you will be able to unmute yourself to ask a question. You can also enter your questions into the chat and we will read your questions out loud. We also invite those of you who are able to access the chat on Zoom to introduce yourself. Slide 2. We acknowledge that everywhere we live and work is Indigenous lands, and our team is located all across the state. One of our offices is located in the traditional homelands of the Lower Tanana Dene people in interior Alaska. Our offices are physically located on Trapiera, meaning Indian Potato Ridge, campus at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. Traditional Chief Peter John from Minto shared the story of this ridge in the 1990s, and the official name was changed in 2013. We also have team members located in Shaktoolik, Quinnahock, and Anchorage. Next slide. This is the Learning Network team. We often work as a team together, and you could see all the team members that we have in the Alaska Tribal Resilience Learning Network. We're part of Melinda Chase is a lead liaison from UAF, and the rest of the liaisons, the tribal liaisons, are employed by the Native American Fish and Wildlife Society. And Krista is our coordinator. Mike DeLu is our communications specialist. And we have Laverne Dementive, UAF, and Ryan Truhe and Jeremy Littell both work for USGS, and Nathan works out of UAF. Next slide. The intent of the Alaska Tribal Resilience Learning Network is to create a community of learning, sharing, technical assistance, training, and support for Alaska tribes and Indigenous communities as they respond and adapt to the current and future impacts of climate change. Colleen Timmer is the tribal administrator for the Native Village of Paimiut and has been involved with the Learning Network. And she's also traveled to New Zealand as well. So we value her participation in our network. So if Colleen, if you're on, And if you have anything to add to our presentation this morning, we encourage you to share any feedback that you have with our audience. There are several different ways that you can participate in the Learning Network. In addition to participating in these information sessions, these include signing up for individual or community check-ins, signing up for the monthly e-bulletin, attending any of our trainings, and yeah, we like, so how before I started my position as a tribal liaison, I was one of the participants in and part of the working group. So I really value and appreciate the Learning Network because it's not a one-way street type of situation. It's like we're actively learning and actively adapting our trainings based on the feedback and the assessments that we get from our participants. But I'm really looking forward to learning more about the godwit this morning. I have not worked directly with our presenters today, but I've had the privilege of partnering with Liliana Neves, PhD, who specializes in the bird subsistence research program at the Alaska Department of Fish and Game Division of Subsistence. Collaborative effort culture at schools and communities in the Yukon Kuskokwim Delta. She sent me a lot of material to prepare me for our upcoming presentations. I learned so much about shorebirds, which include the bar-tailed godwit, that we are going to learn more about in this morning's session. Another thing that I want to share is that as we were preparing for this session, I was reassured by the title, Children of the Sky, because as an Indigenous Alaska Native learning about shorebirds, I was reminded of my ancestors and their will to survive amid harsh obstacles. Hearing about the impacts that they face got me thinking about our own loss of language, culture, and our way of life. So I'm eager to learn more about these amazing children of the sky with you all today. Koyan. And yeah, Dan.
Shall I start?
Yes, thank you.
Great. All right. Well, thank you for that introduction, Geraldine. We're super happy to be able to share with you as well. Let me get my screen sharing going. How does that look? Can people see that? Great. All right. Well, I'll move past this slide and go straight into the topic of today's discussion. Children of the Sky. This is Estelle's title. It's a beautiful name that to me evokes both our connection to the birds and the birds' connections to us. And we're so lucky to live in Alaska, where we have literally millions of individuals of hundreds of species that come back and forth between Alaska and all parts of the globe. And it's a really beautiful thought to think of them as our children. They support us and we support them. And today's presentation is focusing on one bird, but like I just said, there's hundreds of species that bind us culturally and ecologically across the globe. And today we're talking about the bar-tailed godwit. And Estelle and I will be presenting today, but this project really benefits from the participation of a couple other colleagues, Jim Johnson at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and Billy van Utrecht at a Te Harenga Waka Victoria University in Aotearoa, New Zealand. This bird connects these two regions and connects all of us. I've had the good fortune to meet both Estelle and Billy by virtue of the godwit. And like Geraldine alluded to, this network is much wider than just the four of us. We work with Lily Naves at the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, with the Wildlife Conservation Society. We have collaborators in Australia focusing on other species of birds. These birds connect people all across the globe. And today we'll be focusing on this bird in particular in the ways that connect us in Alaska to Aotearoa and New Zealand. And this is the bar-tailed godwit. This is a female godwit. And I've listed three names in both Yupik and Chupik, Sugarpak, Tevatavak, Kayahuak. Hopefully I do justice to those pronunciations, and we put those for you in the hope that they resonate with you, that maybe you know these birds by other names. And in Aotearoa in New Zealand, they're called the kuaka. And as we know, birds are culturally important all around the world. I can't think of a single culture that doesn't love and embrace birds. And this is certainly the case in Alaska, where birds are important culturally, both for art and dance, as exemplified by this beautiful mask on the right-hand side of the slide. This is a mask from the early 1900s from the lower Kuskokwim Delta, depicting a godwit, a cugerpak. And more than just for their beauty and for their grace, they're also important food resources that bar-tailed godwits in particular are an important subsistence resource, where Liliana Naves at Alaska Department of Fish and Game has estimated about 1,100 godwits per year are consumed and it's almost all exclusively focused on a handful of villages on the lower Kuskokwim Delta. And I'll get to that later in the talk, why this is the case. But these birds in general, and godwits in particular, are very important to Alaska culture. And this is very much the case in Aotearoa, New Zealand as well. And our collaborator, Billy, comes from Wanganui. Wanganui is a river, it's a district in Aotearoa. And this is a picture of the river. And it's a really fascinating story. And I've been really privileged to learn more about it, that Wanganui River is one of very few places in the world that has actually gained legal status of personhood. So in the same way that Alaska Native cultures have an appreciation for sight and for non-human beings, this is certainly the case in Maori culture. And Wanganui River in 2017 was afforded legal status. And this was the result of what's been called the longest lawsuit in history, wherein the Wanganui iwi were fighting for the conservation and the sustainability of this river, and they view this river as kin. And this view of kin extends not just to these wild places, but also to the animals that inhabit them. And so I want to briefly introduce this beautiful animal. This is a male bar-tailed godwit. This picture was taken just about a week ago from the mouth of the Wanganui River. This is AJD. You can see the inscribed leg band on this bird's upper right leg. This is a bird that it was banded in 2008. It's unknown how old the bird was at that time, but it's now 17 years later. This is a very old godwit that has been going back and forth between Wanganui and Alaska. And this is a bird that really helped connect Estelle to Wanganui, and she'll describe that relationship later in the talk. So when I present this talk, I'm going to kind of tell you about my scientific arc of discovery. I'm a biologist. I've been studying shorebirds in Alaska for about 25 years now. And along with many colleagues, we've learned a lot about bar-tailed godwits. It only got us so far. And that's where Estelle and Billy are going to hopefully help us take over. But I'm going to spend the next 5 or 10 minutes describing to you what's so special about bar-tailed godwits and why they're so revered. Bar-tailed godwits, there are a lot of different populations around high Arctic latitudes. They breed around the world, but there's a unique population that breeds only in Alaska, and it numbers only about 125,000 birds. That's not very many in the grand scheme of things. I mean, literally, you can count them in an aerial survey all at once. It's that limited in number. These birds, they spend the winter in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and Australia. And when I say winter, actually, these birds are very clever. It's summer down there. They leave Alaska when the weather starts to turn in late fall, and they fly nonstop across the Pacific Ocean to these wintering sites, which it's spring and summer down there. They're just chasing summer around the globe. And these nonstop flights, really, we only discovered about 20 years ago through tracking technology using very small satellite transmitters that track them across the Pacific Ocean. So because of the small population size and this really limited distribution, this species is considered a species of greatest conservation concern by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. In this map, these static lines show the results of tracking of individual birds that colleagues who worked on bar-tailed godwits before me, but current day tracking as well. These tracks kind of show these static lines, and they help you imagine sort of the annual cycle of the movements of these birds. So they're moving from their wintering sites. I should do them the honor of saying summering sites in Australia, in New Zealand, Aotearoa, New Zealand, and Australia, and they fly nonstop over a 7-day period in our spring in early March or April, 6,200 miles nonstop flight. These birds can't land on the water to the Yellow Sea. They burn a lot of energy that they've worked to accumulate all across their non-breeding period in Aotearoa. And so they spend 40 days in the Yellow Sea to put on fat so that they can come to Alaska and breed. And so after a little over a month in the Yellow Sea, they then conduct their next leg of their flight to Alaska, where they arrive in early May and they breed at coastal tundra sites throughout the state. In late June and July, when they finish their breeding biology, they slowly gather out near the mouth of the Kuskokwim River. And this is something that we learned only very recently. If we'd known to go ask people in the villages of the lower Kuskokwim, they could have told us this, because these birds gather in huge numbers in preparation for their nonstop migration. And this is the migration that's considered the longest nonstop migration in the animal kingdom. It's typically about a 7 or 8 day nonstop flight. They depart from the mouth of the Kuskokwim River when a big low pressure system comes through. These birds can sense these weather systems, and they take off on the backside of these low pressures that cross the Bering Sea, and they get a huge tailwind that pushes them out across the Pacific. And then they're on their own, just navigating on their way to Aotearoa. And they arrive there beginning in early September, and then the juveniles follow after the adults, usually coming in mid-October. And those static lines are really kind of boring and don't do justice to the migration. This is an animation of these same animal tracks that show the timing. So you can see early March, all the birds are leaving Aotearoa, going to the Yellow Sea. And by early May, they're moving to Alaska. And you can see those dots moving around coastal areas in Alaska. And by July and August, they start to stage near the mouth of the Kuskokwim River, where they make this amazing nonstop migration. Not all are nonstop. You can see some of those lines stop shorting, but they all find their way back to sites in Western Australia and Aotearoa. So I'll let that run one more time, just to give you an idea about this amazing idea that these birds are connecting essentially 3 discrete parts of the globe. They know where they spend the non-breeding season. They know where they stage in the Yellow Sea to find food. They have a breeding site in Alaska, and then they stage at the mouth of the Kuskokwim. They're truly globetrotting individuals that link these regions of the world. And this is a zoom of that same animation that shows how they use sites in Alaska. So you can see come early May, the first birds start to arrive, and they usually come to the lower Kuskokwim Delta. And then the birds that breed further north in Alaska on the Seward Peninsula or on the North Slope will work their way up. And so now they're at their breeding sites. All those little flickering lights are birds that are sitting on nests, hatching eggs and raising young. And as those young fledge, invariably, they all come back to the lower Kuskokwim Delta. And what we found through doing dedicated aerial surveys is that they're all staging near the mouth of the Kuskokwim River at a series of shoals near the Kuskokwim River, near the villages of Chifornak, Kipnuk, Kwingillingok, and Congiganak. So it's amazing. This entire population stages there each fall before conducting this nonstop migration. So what is it about the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta? Well, in the summer, it's an amazingly rich complex of wetlands interspersed with upland tundra habitat where these birds come to lay their eggs and raise their young. And in the fall, as I just showed you with that animation, the entire population for the entire state essentially comes to these really incredibly productively rich intertidal wetlands. This is a picture that I took. I had the good fortune to spend some time out in these staging sites in 2009. And literally you're looking out at these 10-kilometer long or 100-kilometer long, 10-kilometer wide mud flats that are just covered with godwits as far as the eye can see. And what are they doing there? The inset image there shows the incredibly rich food resources to be found in the mud. you can imagine the bar-tailed godwits with their very long bills. They use those to probe in the mud, and they're eating these tiny little clams that are incredibly energy rich, and they crush the hard shells in their muscular gizzard, and that's how they gain the fat they need to make this migration. They double their body mass in about 30 or 60 days staging at the mouth of the Kuskokwim River. They'll go from a skinny little bird that was, not an ounce of fat on it, that was raising chicks, to 2 months later, they're literally like a gigantic fat covered, like long distance jet. They use that fat to fuel their migration all the way to New Zealand. So this region is incredibly important for the species. And this image shows the results of some aerial surveys that I did with Jim Johnson at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in 2017 and 2018 that shows this lower. I don't know that I can see if I can try to do the laser pointer. So the mouth of the Kuskokwim, to orient you over here, and the size of these red dots are the size of the flocks that we detected during aerial surveys. And the flocks were so huge that we actually used digital cameras to take pictures, and then we came back into the office and digitized each one. So the counts were really accurate, and there's no way I could have estimated these on my own. It was just too hard. We saw some flocks as big as 35,000 birds. So essentially a third of the world's population all in one flock out on these shoals and islands near the mouth of the Kanak River, near Kipnuk, near Kungiganak and Kungelengok. An incredibly important spot for these birds. So working with researchers in Aotearoa, we found these researchers had good connections with researchers in the Yellow Sea, and each spring they would go there and try to study what was going on. And we came to learn that bar-tailed godwits, along with all the other birds that use this flyway, the East Asia Australasia flyway, were facing really dire conservation threats. That within the last 5 decades, over 65% of the tidal flats in the Yellow Sea region had been reclaimed. They'd been diked off, like you see in this image, where they build a embankment, they pump the water out, and invariably this was for industrial plants, either steelworks or factories to build more junk for people in the West. And so these godwits are losing a lot of this critical habitat that they rely on each spring. And we also came to learn that the godwits were facing real threats due to poaching and accidental take. This is an image that was shared with me by a friend showing nets that were put up to illegally poach godwits. And there's a lot of accidental take that's related to fisheries. This is a picture that a friend shared with me showing godwits staging in the spring in the Yellow Sea. And in the background, you see fishing nets, and those nets are meant to catch these mantis shrimp, but invariably they catch hundreds, maybe thousands. It's unknown how many godwits enter these nets at low tide, get stuck, and the tide rises and kills them. So what we've come to learn, we know that populations of bar-tailed godwits are slowly declining. We know that they face a lot of conservation threats, and we know that godwits need our help. But trying to make those connections has been incredibly challenging. I'm a research wildlife biologist in Alaska. Trying to figure out what's going on in New Zealand and China is really difficult. So it begs the question, how do you manage and protect migratory species like godwits? And this was sort of the arc of my scientific career, where we know a lot about godwits, but we're not making connections that meaningfully conserve the birds. And that's when we had the amazing good fortune to meet Estelle, who introduced us to Billy. And I'll let Estelle take over now so she can fill you in on kind of the human dimensions of what this project is all about.
Okay, Dan, Angutekaraq, my Yupik calling name is Angutekaraq. It means the one who's supposed to be a man, or more accurately, the one who will provide. I'm originally from the village of Hooper Bay. However, I'm the eldest daughter of Forrest and Dorothy Thomson of Port Campbell, Washington. I'm the eldest daughter of the late Apangusok Charlie Gayok from Chafornik. I'm the eldest granddaughter of Naifkuk and Kairayok, Hillary and Maria Kairayok of Jafornik. The second eldest granddaughter of the late Alice and George Napoleon Ulgan and Juplorok of Hooper Bay, and the eldest granddaughter of the late Henry and Alice Thomson of Fort Campbell, Washington. My family connections are such that, you know, coming from the YK Delta, birds are a huge part of our life. For those of you that study birds and are biologists or other types of ologists, you know that the YK Delta is incredibly rich in biodiversity. So we are surrounded from the time that we were born with a plethora of birds, as well as other types of wildlife. But birds are a mainstay. We have over 220 species that nest in our lands from all over the world. And my area happens to be what I'd like to think of as like the crown jewels of the Pacific Flyway. You know, these incredible birds come from all over the lands, all over the world, and they travel to our lands to nest and rear their young. So being from that area and having birds being so important to us, working as the president for my tribal government, there are a number of things that are important to us. We had the good fortune of having a friend of ours introduce us to some people that came up from Aotearoa. And I will ask Billy to briefly explain that story. So, Billy, if you wouldn't mind just hopping on and explaining what you have done or what you had done to get up here, and then we can continue our story from there.
Tēnā rā tātou. Really great to be joining you from Wanganui and Aotearoa. Greetings. So I guess I really want to recognize someone who's on the call, Melinda Chase, as someone who hosted my colleague here, Cecilia Kumaroa, and I on a little trip where we took a collaborative art science research project that took some environmental data, some flow data from the Wanganui River, and brought it together with this digital animation, and that's Cecilia's forte. She's an artist and particularly focuses on digital design at the moment. And we took that to showcase that work in Alaska, because when we were developing the project, one of our kaumatua, our elders, reminded us that the kuaka, or the Mātau godwits, were important to the river. And we didn't really know that, to be honest, and we're still trying to figure all of that out. Many of us didn't know we had a very small population of kuaka that frequent our river estuary. And it is small by comparison to lots of the other sites, like the photos that Dan has. Ours shy in comparison. And we showcased that work, and our intent was literally to put it out to First Nations across Alaska if there was an interest to collaborate. We didn't really know how quickly and how large this program would get, and I blame Estelle for that. And blame is the appropriate word. We always like to say that this kaupapa or project or program is tupuna-led or ancestor-led, and that we're just trying to run to keep up with it. It has its own energy and volition. And so in response to that, we took a few books about AJD. So the guy who took that photo of AJD, he's written a book about the bird. And so we know so much about him because of Paul's obsession, I would say, with him. And so we know that he leaves at around 5 p.m. He leaves Wanganui at around 5 p.m. on the 25th of March. Very consistently each year. He's deviated a few times. And last year, when Estelle and the rest of the Paimiut delegation were here, he decided to deviate the most he's ever deviated in the last 17 years. So while they were here to send him off and to talk about our relationships through him and other kuaka, he waited until they had gone to leave the day after. So, so a little bit cheeky, but we keep building our program and all the connections across Australia. And I don't know if you know anybody knows Estelle, but she's really good at doing that. The network has grown enormously, and yeah, we're just trying to keep up with how quickly it's grown. Aye, is that
Yeah.
enough?
Oh yeah. Well, I'll just elaborate a little bit more because what had happened was when they came up and they put out this call, I missed their presentation at the Campbell Creek Science Center. So I was really feeling like, oh, I missed such a great opportunity. So I reached out and then I was able to get the contact information. We began this conversation and I introduced myself in my traditional way. And I also let them know that one of the reasons that I was so interested in this is because where I come from on the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta, we are experiencing climate change at a rate that's 4 times faster than the rest of the world. We've already seen steep declines in our ocean biodiversity, ocean river biodiversity because of climate change, because the ocean's warming, because we're having algal blooms that are really unusual and a whole bunch of other things. We've seen a number of other bird species die off. So we have had murres wash up on our beaches, as well as shearwaters, which don't really belong there. But when we began talking, we realized just how much significance these birds not only had to my people in the YK, but also to the Māori. And one of the things that I have realized over time, over my 25, 30-year career of working in cultural and tribal education and tribal governance and in all these different spaces, that there is much more to a story than a story. And I think what struck me was how many similarities that we had with the cultural and spiritual significance of these birds. Billy did not mention, but the Māori actually credit this bird with showing them the land of the long white cloud when they were seafarers, when they were explorers. And that gave me chills because this bird comes from my homelands and it travels this unbelievable distance. And to have some of Billy's ancestors being led to their homelands by this bird, it's unbelievable. But I digress. So I was working on a number of projects that were related to climate, related to our cultural ranger program when I got the information about Billy. So we started sharing information about, the significance for us and finding out that Billy was a scientist as well. And Billy, tell us what your specialty is.
So frogs, actually, but there's not too many frogs in Aotearoa. I was trained in Australia where there are many more froggies to research, but more particularly, I'm interested in evolutionary ecology. So how with these migratory species, I'm very interested in how such complex migration behaviors evolve and are maintained in populations. Mm.
Yeah, so naturally, with the kind of marriage of culture and science, this was something that both of our peoples were incredibly interested in. So we planned that cultural exchange. Billy invited me to speak at the Wanganui Climate Forum, which was an incredible success. And we began this epic relationship into not only sharing our culture, but also our concerns because these birds have had such a long-standing place in our relationships and our history of not only our lands, but our peoples, it was incredibly important for both of us to understand the implications of what climate change would mean, not only to us as people, but to our non-human relatives that share our land and have been our teachers and we consider ancestors. So this talk actually opened up all these avenues to learning from not only the Yupik and the Māori people, but also First Nations Australian mob, Tasmanian mob. And then Billy and I were invited to speak at the Global Ecological Governance Forum. They had a symposium, the East Asian Australasian Flyway Partnership Symposium, a science symposium. And we were able to tell not only our story, but why the conservation of the bar-tailed godwit and understanding not only like the ecology, but like what's happening and why it's so important for us to make sure that people are focused on migratory species. It was an incredible opportunity that that his elders actually, don't blame me, Billy, it was your elders that kept telling me, make this happen, make this conference happen. So it was something I had thought about for a number of years because Alaska doesn't have migratory bird conferences that are Indigenous led. There's so many conferences that we go to that are focused on the science, but they don't relate very much, if anything, about the people. And if you look at migratory species as a whole, you look at migratory birds as a whole, where they nest and where they land, there has typically been Indigenous presence in both ends of those flyways. We were able to meet with the folks in Beijing on the Yaluzheng, on the Yellow Sea, near the mouth of the Yellow River on those estuary lands, and connect the third piece of this puzzle that we were trying to put together. And we were able to talk with them and to figure out, well, how can we work together? We're still trying to figure out how we're going to work with the Chinese and other researchers in the area. However, we are continuing on with this relationship of ours because, as Billy said, this was ordained kind of by our ancestors. This was something that is being pushed by our ancestors because these relatives of ours, these ancestors of ours, these birds are so important to us, and they need to have a voice to speak for them. And so this conference that we're hosting is going to be at the end of June here in Alaska, here in Anchorage at APU. And yes, I love the logo as well. That's Kawahini Denner. She has done some amazing logos. She did the logo for the Utqiagvik bird watching festival last year. But we wanted to express a number of different things. And science, yes, it's important because we as Indigenous peoples of the world, we are applied scientists. We always have been, we always will be. And I think that's also important to highlight because what we don't see in a lot of migratory bird conferences and spaces is the fact that we've had this longstanding history and we know a lot more about some of these species than a scientist can. And I've talked with Dan, I've talked with some of his partners at the Migratory Bird Office here in Alaska, and we tell them about things that maybe they've spent their entire career not learning. So it's a really wonderful relationship that this cugerpak, this kuaka, has brought to us, and how it's opened doors not only for my tribe but for other peoples here in Alaska to be able to interact with our relatives, our bird relatives, and the people on the other end of their migratory path. What this ended up doing as well is because of this work that we're doing together, Billy, myself, and a number of other Indigenous peoples have put together a migratory kin collective. And it first just started with us and the Wanganui Māori in Aotearoa, but it's expanded. You know, we have Trawaway Pakana from Tasmania. We've got a bunch of different mob First Nations Australians who are doing ranger work in their country, as well as conservation work with migratory species. One of our partners is through Applied Archaeology International and the Taliak Rangers in Esperance. They work with shearwaters. We have other partners in other First Nations Land Trust organizations in Australia. And most recently, we have even expanded our relationships to encompass some of the Kanaka Maoli in Hawaii, and they will be at the migratory conference as well. And our relatives in our Maasai relatives in Kenya. So we are expanding this network, this migratory kin collective, to as many places around the world that have migratory birds in their culture, in their histories, and also in their science. This summit was an idea that I had because my goal has been to connect the world indigenously. We'll connect it through science, we'll connect it through bird work, we'll connect it through any means possible, but we are going to be connecting our Indigenous peoples all over the world. We also are bringing together Indigenous communities that are doing work like my tribe and like Billy's, to place the places within proximity to researchers like Dan and Jim and some of our other partners here within the state, but also from other places. Some of our Māori relatives actually have their own research facilities. Some of our other relatives also have their own organizations that are dedicated to conservation and to science. So we're very, very excited about this. And was there anything else either one of you wanted to add? Did I miss anything? And I don't remember how much time we have left. I think we wanted to have some time for questions.
Yes, thank you so much for your wonderful presentation, and thank you, Billy, for what you've contributed to our session this morning. Is there any questions that any of the participants have? Krista, Lori, Melinda, do you have anything you wanted to share during this presentation regarding this or the learning network, the work that we do?
Yeah, well, I might just draw attention to Keaton Martin's comment in the chat here. Is climate change affecting the low pressure systems the birds use to assist in migration?
That's a really good question. We've certainly seen a change in the frequency and intensity of the low pressure systems as a result of climate change. I'm aware of a few studies that have looked at this with respect to the resilience of these bird migrations. And this is one thing that climate change doesn't obviously screw up, thankfully. The suggestion is that these storm systems will persist in such a way that they'll still be predictable for these birds. But it's a really good question. And that's one of our greatest concerns, that climate change can affect these species in so many ways, and these birds really rely on predictable weather systems to make these migrations. So yeah, that remains to be seen.
Speaking from a tribal perspective, one of the projects that my village had undertaken with one of our partners, Alaska Wildlife Alliance, we actually employed a climate resilience specialist, so somebody who is doing modeling and work on trying to figure out exactly what's going to be happening in the YK region. And, you know, that's where we got some of the information about us happening to be the most delicate community or delicate area in Alaska. You know, we're experiencing climate change at a rate that's 4 times faster. We fully expect to see storm systems like Typhoon Merbok become more frequent and unpredictable. And so that's a concern. We also have concerns about coastal erosion, riverine erosion, and then from that same vulnerability study, and it's backed up by other studies that we looked at, that the permafrost in the YK region is going to be gone by 2040. So that's going to be changing the landscape as well. We wanted to try to get a little bit ahead of some of these predictions so that we can bring light to, you know, what we're experiencing, what we can experience for these birds. My tribe with our rangers will be doing demonstration projects to test, to see what we can do to help with maybe habitat loss and that type of thing. One of the projects that we are looking at in the future is actually creating, you know, nesting platforms, that kind of thing. We have a lot of area these birds go to, so I'm sure that eventually they move to other areas, but we'd like to keep them in our region as much as possible. But the prognosis or the prospect of it becoming an untenable place to live in the future is very real. Like by the end of the century, kind of real. So, and I think that's one of the main reasons why this has been such a there's been a fire that's been lit underneath me to make sure we get on top of this work and to make sure as many people know that we are doing this work and that we also need help. You know, building these networks, it has been taking a great deal of time, and thank you, Billy, for saying that. You know, it's something that I do well, but you know, there are so many people, so many conversations that we need to have, that we need to be able to have people know that, yeah, please contact Dan and Jim and the Migratory Bird Office. Please contact Billy or myself or Melinda Chase, or, you know, some of our people are working in concert with one another on different aspects of this research and this groundwork. We need to make sure that we have full resources available, but we also, you know, encourage like the expansion of our capacity by expanding our partnerships and our networks. We can't do this alone. We can't do this in a vacuum. And the other part of having this summit here in Alaska, in addition to having researchers and people who are doing the work, as well as Indigenous communities that are also participating in different ways, is also to bring together some funders. So this first summit is actually the inaugural summit. It's going to be limited in size because we want to prioritize what's going to happen in future summits. This is something that that the elders have said, you have to do this. You just have to. And so the first summit may not be perfect, but we're looking at figuring out how we can ensure that future summits are following predictable pathways of not only like sharing the work, but also finding opportunities for us to work together, and also finding pots of money that don't necessarily fall within the traditional grant making process. So we'll have philanthropic peoples there, people's foundations and conservation organizations. And we even have a documentary filmmaker that is going to be following us around and talking to us about this relationship that we have. So Alaska is vast, and we have lots of places where birds nest, and we have lots of people that know these birds intimately. And so that's another reason that we're on this, is so that we can kind of have a call to action. We're mobilizing our bird network. We're singing the song, sending the call down the songway throughout all of our species and all of our communities, that this is something that we need to work on. So
I might just add, if I can, onto that, to build on the narrative around AJD. I think there is real value to focus on the narrative of a specific bird. I think it's something that people can grapple with really easily and nicely, but also given the migration route and its complexity, the experiences of climate change are, huge for these guys. They're going to experience it very differently in Alaska to how they're going to experience in Aotearoa, to the Yellow Sea, and then also the inclement weather that we might expect to increase with climate change along the flyway path, might blow them off course. So that's going to, for a bird that has this really, tightly woven physiology and behavior to this migration behavior, the risks are really hard to know as to how climate change is going to impact them. So I think it's actually a compelling and important narrative to focus on AJD in that instance. And because Paul is so obsessed and has done that work around AJD, we can try and understand his experience of climate change across the entire range. So we're still sort of starting that work. Just anecdotally, then it sort of is indicative last year in particular, where we had this unseasonal weather pattern where the winds were totally against the kuaka. So we saw lots of them from Aotearoa delay their departure. And AJD being about 4 days late, Dan probably appreciates the impacts of that more than I can. But if you rock up to your feeding grounds 4 days late, have you missed the food resource, or have other manu had their fill and you're coming in late? If you arrive to Alaska a couple of days late, are you going to be able to feed in your feeding that you need to do with your breeding behaviors to then be able to depart on time to get back? So it's like there's such a fine balance in there that, and the impacts of climate change, I feel, could be so diffuse. It's so hard to answer that question in a really comprehensive way. Yeah, but a great question nonetheless. Yeah.
yeah, and there is actually hope. One of the things that Billy and I were really surprised by, at least I was anyway, was when we went to Beijing, and we found out that the folks there, in light of all the development that the government had done, they actually created a UNESCO World Heritage Site for those staging areas on the Yellowjang, on the Yellow Sea. And I was so impressed by that. It gave me a lot of hope that they valued the staging area for the birds so much that they are creating a globally protected area that is not going to be easy to develop in. It's not going to be easy to pollute. They have these regulations that are so stringent. They go above any state, local, or even federal regulations for that area, and they hold it to a higher standard, because to get a UNESCO World Heritage Site delineation, or if they're becoming these things, the requirements are really stringent, and they all have to work together to make sure that they're living up to this high standard. And that was something that made me think, well, maybe something that we can do here in Alaska. Maybe it's something that we can do in other places where there's a scientific significance, cultural, ecological, and it has to be unique. Is there anything else, guys?
Thank you so much, Estelle and Billy and Dan, for your wonderful presentation. And I just wanted to end the session with, as an Indigenous person, like I know, like I understand that without the connection, we can't really comprehend what we're learning. And so I thank you so much for highlighting everything that you've highlighted today. And I keep saying this, but I really appreciate your work and the efforts that you have, or the efforts that you're doing. So thank you so much, Angutekaraq, for everyone that joined us today. And I'm looking forward to learning more about your research.
Melinda, do you have a question or a comment?
Oh, yes, I didn't want to interrupt Geraldine there, but yeah, I think I just really want to stress, and you guys have illustrated it so well here, that as Indigenous people, we're working at all levels, especially when we're on two different sides of, the earth, up at being in the high Arctic and then below the equator. But I think especially, with the amount of change that's happening in the Arctic, to have made this link is hugely significant. We have this rainbow visual that just shows, from local to regional to statewide to Arctic to national to global, that, as Indigenous people in Alaska, we're operating at all those levels. And then to see this link, knowing that, we have relations with Aotearoa, with Maori people and other folks around the globe, but in particular those areas, they've had relationships with many of our Indigenous people here in Alaska, like Southeast, and now to elevate this, I think, is just really critical. And sometimes I think about where we're at. It's great to see that the summit is happening. And how do we just, like you said, Estelle, keep elevating it in a way that even brings our own populations along, our own Alaskan population. We're looking at potential significant development in Alaska with critical minerals. And, how do we just keep sharing out, how significant each region is and each land area is, especially for, like you said, our non-human relatives. So I just really want to thank you all for your work and the fact that you just keep expanding this. And hopefully everybody else on here will share this and elevate, what this relative is going through, and bring other people along in this conversation.
Anna, Melinda, I appreciate your work so much. If it wasn't for you, we wouldn't, Billy and I and our relatives in Aotearoa and the South probably wouldn't have gotten connected this way. So we really appreciate the fact that you brought us together.
Don't get in.
Kia ora mai tātou. Thank you.